Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for your patience. It's shortly after 11, and we have patiently waiting online Dr. Mokisa Kituyi of UNCTAD and the Deputy Minister of Agrarian Policy and Food for Ukraine, Mr. Dimitrasevic. The minister sends his apologies. He's been called away on urgent business and has asked Mr. Dimitrasevic to take his place. And on my left, we have very pleased to welcome Mr. Samir Briko, who is the chairman and CEO of Eurochem. And just coming up to the stage now with a theatrical appearance is Dr. John Hulsman, who is a political risk analyst from Aspinia, Italia. So our subject today is the war in Ukraine and the danger to global food security, which is posed by the war, not just by the fighting itself in the agricultural heartlands of Europe's grain belt, but also the unintended consequences that arise once you start a conflict. So to guide the debate, I propose to take the speakers in the order they appear on your program. I would ask each of the speakers to try to keep to a maximum of 10 minutes, if they can, at the end of which we will have questions and answers. We will have to draw the debate to a close at 10 to 12. So this is not just going to be some chin wagging. Let's get some serious bullet points out of the discussion. And we'll wind up at 10 to 12. So without any further introductions, if I could invite the Deputy Minister of Agrarian Policy and Food for Ukraine, Mr. Dimitrasevic Markian-Orestovic. You have the floor, sir. Welcome to the conference.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for giving me the floor. First, I want to give you some short overview of the situation in agriculture in Ukraine, starting from 24th of February, when Russian Federation started their aggression against Ukraine. First problem we faced after the beginning of this aggression was the limitation and of our exports through our Black Sea ports and other seaports. You should be aware that 95% of exports of agriculture products were made by our seaports. So in the first months after 24th of February, we faced a huge problem of low export capacity. Before 24th of February, we exported about 5 to 6 million tons of agriculture products with our Black Sea ports. In March, in first months after the war began, we exported only 200,000 tons. You see the difference: 5-6 million per month and 200 tons. We were shocked, but we immediately started to search for some alternative routes. And we tried to increase our export capacity in every way, in every possibility we had. So we started to export grains and other foodstuff with alternative corridors to our western borders to European countries, first of all, Romania, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia. In July, on previous months, we exported 2.66 million tons of grains and other foodstuff. So you see how our export capacity with alternative routes increased: 200,000 tons in March and 2.66 million tons in July. Due to this low export capacity, we faced another problems. In March, we had on our stocks about 25 million tons of grains from previous year's yield. And this is the amount that we, without a war, we could export in 2-3 months. This is the amount of products that Ukrainian farmers had no possibility to sell. So our farmers faced the lack of operational funds for sowing and harvesting campaign. This problem was solved with soft loans from Ukrainian banks guaranteed by the government. And we had opportunity to provide our sowing campaign. But still, we had another problem. About 20% of our territories are temporarily occupied, or there were held hostilities. A lot of fields were mined. A lot of areas were under missile attacks. So one of the biggest problem was the demining of our fields after the occupation of Kyiv region, Chernihiv region, Sumy region. And unfortunately, we had our machinery, equipment, and our people destroyed, and we had this death. We provided our sowing campaign on 80% of our territory. At the moment, we are harvesting about 25 million tons of different grains were harvested at the moment. And the forecast for this year's yield is about 67 million tons. In comparison with previous year, we had 108 million tons harvested previous year. But still we have another problem. We had a huge amount of grains from previous year's yield that was not sold and was stored in Ukraine. And we have at the moment harvesting our this year's yield. The problem is that before the war, we had about 75 million tons of storage capacity for our grains. At the moment, about 5 million tons of these storages were destroyed by Russians, and about 10 million tons of storages are situated in temporarily occupied territories. So we understand and that our farmers will face the deficit of storage capacity until the end of October, and for about 15 million tons. That's what we are actively working on with our partners and donors to provide our farmers with some temporary grain storage solutions. For example, grain sleeves, grain bags that are used for temporary storage. But still, we have a lot of problems. First one is low domestic internal prices for grains. You can see the situation. We have low export capacity and big amount of grains inside of Ukraine. And if we talk about 2 months ago, the prices, internal prices, for example, wheat, they achieved about $50 or $70 per ton. But our farmers need to spend $100 to grow this grain per ton. So it's one of our biggest problems at the moment. Speaking about grain corridor, about this agreement that was achieved for transportation of grains from our Odessa ports, at the moment we can see that we exported by Odessa, these 3 Odessa ports, about 1.3 million tons at the moment. So we expect until the end of this month, until the end of August, that we will export about 4 million tons of grains. But this grain corridor is something that we cannot rely on. We don't understand how long it will work. Everything can happen every day. You see, on the first day after the agreements were signed, Russians attacked our Odessa port facilities with missiles. So we tried to rely on our alternative routes, corridors to European Union countries. First of all, it's a Romanian destination with our Danube River ports, and also Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia, as I mentioned. And we plan to increase this our export capacity on these directions by establishing and building terminals on the borders, so we can transport grains more smooth. Speaking about damages, direct, for our assumption, direct damages for agriculture in Ukraine achieved about $4.5 billion. In indirect damages losses, we assume the estimation is about $25 billion at the moment. Unfortunately, these numbers increase every day because we have hostilities held. It influences our farmers because all the situation with the war and low export capacity and low internal prices. We can hear questions from our farmers why we should sow winter crops, in particular winter wheat, if we cannot sell our products and prices are low. So it's just brief overview of situation in Ukraine, and I want to appeal to the participants and to our partner states. And I must say that the best way to improve the situation in agriculture in Ukraine that impacts world food security is to defeat Russian army on our territory and to completely deblock our seaports in Ukraine, so we can balance this situation with prices and export capacity in Ukraine. Thank you, and I'm ready to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Minister. If I could ask you one question. You mentioned about the need for demining equipment so that farmers can operate more safely in the fields that have been mined. Is there anything that Ukraine's partners can do to speed up the delivery of the demining equipment to improve this program?
Thank you for your question. Government works very tightly with our partners, but we have to understand one important thing. First of all our possibilities to demine are used to demine our towns, villages, where people live, and the second stage is the mining of our fields for agriculture. As I know, we use all the possibilities we have for the mining teams, but the problem is the huge areas of the mining, and the mining is not the only security issue for our farmers. We can see that Russians attack us even from the border from their side of the border, even on the occupied territories, like in Chernihiv or Sumy Oblast. So to estimate the amount of this work, it's huge amount of this work.
Thank you. We'll take one or two questions for the minister, if that's possible. First, Dimitros Kurko here from Ukrinform, and then David Abiago from Argus.
Dmitry Shkurko, National News Agency of Ukraine. Thank you for the floor. My first question is about the routes of transportation. You just mentioned that the sea routes are not stable, and you cannot expect they will be stable in the future. So that my question is, how effective is the so-called solidarity lines which were provided by EU for transportation of the Ukrainian grain, and have you managed to solve the issue of railway transportation of wheat, which was a bottleneck in that regard? And the second question is quite short. How much grain was stolen by the Russian invaders from Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. First of all, I want to underline that we do very hope for this grain corridor from Odessa ports will work properly, but at the same time, we understand that security situation in this part is very sensitive, so we have to rely on our alternative routes. And speaking about solidarity lanes, we had a lot of progress and work done with our European partners, in particular with Polish and Romanian side. We lifted all the bureaucracy, all unnecessary bureaucracy on our borders, speaking about veterinary certificates. And if we talk about numbers, we understand that about 50% of our grain export goes with Danube River ports. About 30% goes with railway, and the rest with trucks, vehicles, lorries. This was the result of cooperation with the European Union, in particular with the Solidarity Lanes initiative. Speaking about the problem with different types of different standards of railway, you should be aware that we have different ones. We have wide gauge in Ukraine and narrow gauge in European Union, in particular in Poland, in Hungary. So every time we want to export with the railway, we have to unload our grain wagons and load European standard grain wagons, or to change gauges on the Ukrainian railway wagons. This is still a problem. Something we can do is to establish and build these transshipment terminals I mentioned. The plan is to make this to make this grain cross the border with grain transshipment equipment that is used in, for example, in port grain terminals or grain elevators in Ukraine. About your next question, it was, sorry, I need to ask you to repeat.
He was asking the value of the cereal products that were funded.
Yes, the amount of stolen grain. We have different estimations from 500,000 tons to 800,000 tons. This is really an issue. You are aware that we had some our diplomats and prosecutor's office working on that, but still it's a very sensitive question for our government.
One question, just a quick one, because we'll have to move on.
David Abiyago from Argus Media. So the first question is, well, on projections. What are your projections for exports of oilseeds and cereals, grains out of the ports in September or this year? And then the projections of the 2022, the next campaign, planting campaign, and production in Ukraine. How much do you think you can produce given the situation? And then the second question is, in terms of fertilizers, so we see the gas price and the fertilizer price going up and up. And on the other side, you mentioned it, the 25 billion loss, or the loss to farmers. How can they pay for these fertilizers, which are essential for them? Are you, as the Ukrainian government, doing anything? Do you have any plans to help them in terms of the next season? Thanks.
Thank you for your question. Our forecast for this year's harvest, as I mentioned, is 67 million tons. We understand that about 40 or 45 million tons of this number should be exported, but it depends on how this grain corridor from Odessa ports will work in the future. Our forecast for August is about 4 million tons. If a grain corridor will work smoothly, we can also understand that this amount will be increased in the next months. But unfortunately, I cannot give you the overall forecast until the end of the year, because the situation changes every week or even every few days. About fertilizers, yes, this is a big issue for our farmers. First of all, prices, but not only fertilizers, but also fuels, the prices for seeds, and everything our farmers need for planting campaign. Partly we will solve this problem with providing these soft loans that were provided for this year's summer spring sowing campaign. We will still provide our farmers with soft loans for the next season, and obviously they try to use fertilizers less than they used to do it before 24th of February. We have enough amount of import of fertilizers, and we expect your question was if the situation with internal prices for grains will not change. We estimate that 30 to 60% less areas will be cropped for next season.
Thank you very much. The question on fertilizers brings us conveniently to our next speaker, Mr. Samir Briko, who's the chairman of Eurochem. Mr. Briko, if you could perhaps explain to us what the impact of the war has been on the global fertilizer business, not least when our food production globally has been reminded by Mother Nature and her weird choices of drought and floods, how important the needs are for fertilizer all over the world. Mr. Briko, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So my name is Samir Briko. I'm the chief executive and at the current stage, and executive chair of Eurochem. Maybe a couple of words about myself. From my name, you can understand that I was not born in Europe. My parents immigrated some 50 years back from Beirut, Lebanon to Sweden. So I am Lebanese by origin. Today I'm Swiss and Swedish. But I have lived the war, and I do understand exactly what war is about. I fought on the streets, Mr. Minister. So I know exactly what tragedies it has. So me as a person and me as a company were very terrified by what's happening. Our souls are with the Ukrainian people. It's a very, very sad story. And of course, we are against war, not only in Ukraine, but everywhere in the world. So about Eurochem. Eurochem is a Swiss company. It has been founded by an entrepreneur out of Russia. The company is one of the few companies in the world which can produce what we call all the nutrients, which means nitrogen, potash, and also phosphates. In many metrics, we'll be on the top 3 of this world. We are one of the few ones who we extract, we produce, we blend, we sell, and all that in the same house under the same roof. Our company is roughly have about 5% of the global market. So I think we have quite a good bird view on what's happening in the market. So we can maybe shed some information, what we see and what we notice, and how the markets are developing. I do know, because we are in this business, that we're trying very hard in order to reduce our consumption of fertilizers. But it's not an easy thing. It's like saying that we want to have cars on aeroplanes or trains running on electricals. And this will take some years. This does not mean that we do not have this as a target, but it will take us 20 to 25 years where we can get some more dependency and less dependency in what we're doing today. Today, more than half of the world use fertilizers in big time. When we were 2 billion people, it was so easy because we had consumers of food, yeah, in the same place which was produced. So through human digestion and animal digestion, you could get everything on place. But today, when the consumption is in China and we produce out of Brazil, it would be very difficult. So that means that without fertilizers, the world is in a very bad shape. More than 5 billion people today in the food, let's say, production, use fertilizers. That means our company, with some 5% global market share, we're responsible more or less about some 300 million people to feed. So if the production is being lost, it's going to be terrible news for everybody. And as you know, market prices are determined not by the mainstream production. It's determined on the margin production. So if there is an interruption, for instance, on an oil gas pipeline somewhere in the world, and maybe it has 50,000 production of equivalent barrel per day, the oil prices will spike with 30%. It's nothing different to what the fertilizer business is about. That means if we squeeze anywhere the fertilizer business, the prices will spike. And what we have seen today is prices are going to above the double. So this is a very important thing. So my company is not sanctioned. It has been confirmed by the US, it has been confirmed by the EU, it has been confirmed by the UK, it has been confirmed by Switzerland that the company is not sanctioned and we can run freely. But that's not the reality. There's a big difference between, sorry to say, what the politicians are saying on one side and what's the reality on the ground. Because what do we see? We see today's plant in Lithuania is stopped to operate. We see today in Estonia, we have a pipeline and a port where we export actually from their ammonia, which is needed in the ammonia phosphates, is stopped. We see operations in Belgium and Antwerpen is running on a part load. We see our major banks in Switzerland do not want to deal with us and stopped actually working with us. So stopping all the accounts, all the money, all the transactions, because they have a fear that we could be, or they could be sanctioned as a result of the actually, which is the company which is not sanctioned. Today, we have a problem with contractors. They do not deliver, we bought plants, they do not deliver the plants because they have a fear. We have a problem with transportation, with logistics. We cannot find boats. We cannot find vessels to transport let's say, the fertilizers. We have a problem with insurances. All that have resulted to 25% reduction of our production, which means that in numbers today, we are putting 50 million or more at risk that they will not get food. We have a concern, of course, and that's why I'm here, if I would like to answer the question also and the concerns which has been raised up. We see fertilizer prices are actually going up. We see the suppliers are reducing their production. We see an increased price tendency, which is not going the healthy way, it's going the other way around. And we could say, but that is a stance which we need to stand as Europeans or Americans or Brazilians or whatever against Russia. I fully support that. Now we have a problem. The problem which we have, this is not about Russia war when it comes to fertilizers, because the treasury income of Russia from fertilizer business is not more than 0.1%. It means nothing to them, but it means for the world. It means my thoughts goes for people in Africa, it goes for people in the subcontinent. And I'm very happy, Mr. Minister, that the first shipment which went from Odessa actually went to Lebanon, went to Tripoli in Lebanon. That was the first shipment. because my old hometown depends 85% on Ukrainian grain. So this is horrible. So what we would like to see, I call it, I have a call to the European Union. I have a call to the World Bank, to United Nations, in order to ensure that there is a free flow of fertilizers in this world. Because if we start to build up barriers, if we start to continue with the hinders, the production will be lower. And if the production is lower, the double price is not enough. It's going to be triple and increasing. And that's nothing which we want to have. I take a personal note. I have a charity. Normally, I don't speak too much about it, but I take care of 50 kids, underprivileged. And I was very happy with my life in order to be able to create a better life for 50 children. Today, I have a responsibility for 200 million people. And that's why I have a mission. And my call is, please, it means nothing for Russia. It means a lot for us. And that's why we need to be smart in order to set up all the instruments to ease free flow of fertilizers, because otherwise the world will be in a worse shape.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brico. You mentioned the United Nations, and if we still have Dr. Kituyi online.
Yes, you do.
So Dr. Kituyi, thank you for waiting patiently. We'd very much welcome your contribution. You have, let's say, 10, 15 minutes maximum on what can the international community do to free up trade in fertilizer and to guarantee safe freight for Ukrainian cargo to reach its markets, which are very much in the African continent. Dr. Kituyi, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. Broadly, the CEO of Eurochem has laid a very good foundation for my contribution. But let me also start by expressing my sense. Okay, first about who I am. As he did, I am a former Minister of Trade and Investment of Kenya, and I just completed my 8 years tour of duty as the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And now I'm in this meeting broadly in my capacity as a honorary chair of the International Tax and Investment Center. Now, broadly, countries of the Global South have expressed their disapproval of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and continue to be in solidarity with any and every action that can contribute to ending this crisis. And there's no better way to stabilize global commodity prices, to curb food and fuel inflation than an end to this unnecessary war. However, the West cannot take the support from the Global South for granted, being such a distant player in the global affairs and not directly related to the dynamics that have brought us to this situation. So expecting unconditional support on the anti-Russian front can sometimes be counterproductive. And there's some activities that can actually fuel that dissent from communities and areas that have been otherwise very broadly in solidarity with the people of Ukraine on what's been happening. Many in Africa, for example, share sentiments expressed recently by the South African Foreign Minister, Naledi Pandor, on a new American piece of legislation called Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa, which she has called an offensive piece of legislation, that you don't compound the goodwill with restrictive legislation inside another country. when you're looking for strengthening international solidarity. But perhaps what will shift the mood most fundamentally in the direction of being against some of the sanctions, some of the actions to assuage Russian invasion in Ukraine, has to do with food and fertilizer security. For reasons that have just been mentioned, that although fertilizer is broadly not sanctioned, but it's kind of collateral damage. It's a destination of collateral damage to the other legitimate sanctions. That when you're sanctioning Russian energy, which as was mentioned, accounts for 37% of the Russian federal budget, fertilizer becomes a casualty. But there's another paradox of war, that the Russian activities in Ukraine have not only crippled Ukrainian supply of food to the world, but have increased the premium on Russian food and fertilizer. That one of the consequences of the actions around the Black Sea is an increased premium on Russian fertilizer. And this is particularly important in areas of the world that are distant from Europe. The impact of such food insecurity on vulnerable populations cannot be underestimated. We should know that in the global south, particularly in Africa, many of the vulnerable communities are still to properly recover from the vulnerabilities of the COVID pandemic. Some of them have been operating at a very, very marginal survival rates because of inequalities in their own institutional setup. And so just a ripple effect of food inflation, of fertilizer inflation, of higher commodity costs can have very significant impact, not just on livelihoods, but also on the vulnerability of governments. Now, the EU and US ban on services to Russian mercantile trade, and combining that with the stronger positions being taken by the Baltic countries, blockading Russian cargo from their territory, are having crippling impact on Russian fertilizer access and pricing for developing countries. And this, it's estimated that this continued challenge downplays the importance of fertilizer for long-term food security. In fact, many people celebrate arrival of a ship of food, but that's short-term food. Long-term food is very dependent on access to adequate and quality fertilizers, which is meaning that the longer-term cost of disruptions in fertilizer supply, combined with inadequacies in affordable food right now, and the thuggeries of nature, we've had strange weather phenomena, a lot of areas with continuing droughts, others with excess rain, is very substantial. But there's something that I need to mention here. A lot of European dialogue in smart sanctions has paid us very, very meticulous attention to loosening sanctions on Russian energy to minimize and gradually break in its impact on European Union livelihoods. We see detailed attention on what to allow, how much of Russian gas, and under what conditions, while building alternative sources as consideration in smart sanctions. But there has not been any similar attention relating to the social impact of sanctions on non-European countries in the vulnerable South, which are directly feeling the consequences of action against the understandable Russian disruptions of global order. African countries have no levers to mitigate the food inflation that derives from policies and actions about which they have never been consulted, and they have never been given any platform to express their unique vulnerability to the collateral consequences of blockade of Russian maritime trade. Note that Russia should not be sanctioned, but the smart intelligence that has informed energy policy of Europe should also be applied on how to ring-fence areas of global South vulnerability, particularly on food and fertilizer. Indeed, the United Nations Secretary General under Guterres' recent statement that a removal of obstacles to calm commodity markets and ease consumer prices, in many ways comes close to touching the issue that we understand the foundation, political and otherwise, of the sanctions, but we must be alive to the collateral damage to the vulnerable in the South. And this calls for clearer policy, both in facilitating pre-production, production, logistics, across the value chain of fertilizers, up to post-delivery services, to secure the livelihoods of the most vulnerable, who have not played any significant role in this war, and whose security will not impede necessary action to stop the Russian activity. Blocking Russia from selling this fertilizer is, of course, also hurting the fertilizer produced elsewhere, straining foundations of global solidarity in the South, and doing very little to deter the aggression. Finally, there is a moral dilemma here. We all feel solidarity for the victims of aggression, and we hope that the livelihoods and the lives and the integrity of Ukraine can be realized in a short while. But we should also be alive to the reality that the dynamics that have been causing mass economic migrations, floods of involuntary migrants, are triggered by food insecurity, are triggered by hopelessness and declining expectation that life will be easier. Now, in countries which have had the triple tragedy in 1 year of bad weather, high input prices for petroleum, for traction, and inaccessible or high-cost fertilizer, the horizon looks very gloomy. And maybe Europe should be preparing for the next wave of involuntary migrants who are a consequence of this. And I think international engagement, joint communication about what are the vulnerabilities, what are the pressure points, and what are the concrete actions that can be taken to reduce conditions that we can all remember from 2011 triggered the Arab Spring uprising from recurring not only in the MENA countries, but even in other countries of the South, would be very helpful as part of the discourse on the Ukraine war. Thank you.
Kitiyu, thank you so much. Now, we'll come back to Dr. Kitiyu in a minute, but I apologize. Rather unusually, Mr. Bricco has a plane to catch, so I will hand over the moderation for a moment to John Hulsman while I help Mr. Bricco catch his plane. I'll be straight back. John, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, you're stuck with me. My favorite angry young man book ever written in foreign policy was David Halberstam's The Best and the Brightest. Not my politics at all, coming from the left. David had been a reporter in Vietnam and had seen on the ground the difference between how policy was made in Washington and what happened in the real world. And he wrote this brilliant, and I advise you all, if you haven't read it or you haven't read it in a while, read it again, thumbnail sketches of the arrogant, overeducated and underprepared Kennedy elite who led us into disaster in Vietnam. And these thumbnail sketches of how they'd gotten ahead and what they'd done wrong really does remind one that for all that I do political risk and grand historical forces rule my life, in the end, people make policy. Humans with all their foibles, good and bad qualities, make up the world that we live in. And I got to meet David at an event late in his life in Big Sur in California, and we spent a delightful evening sharing a bottle of Chardonnay and talking about how silly Washington was and all the people we knew in common. One of the best evenings of my life. And at the end of it, I said how much I'd enjoyed his book and how it had been useful in me thinking about that you all tend to get America and the West wrong. You all think it's Macbeth is the play. A bunch of very wise, cynical, evil people moving chess pieces about like Game of Thrones or House of Cards. Wrong play. The Shakespeare play of note is not Macbeth, it's Hamlet. A bunch of arrogant guys getting everything wrong and not understanding how the world really works. Or as Deep Throat said in All the President's Men, forget the myths you've heard about the White House. These aren't very bright guys and things got out of hand. This is my experience of 15 years in Washington. You don't understand. It's arrogant guys not understanding how the world works. David laughed and he said to me, You know, you can sum up my book by the simple idea that all the negotiations that went on in the Kennedy and Johnson years about what to do in Vietnam had to do with Americans. Had to do, I'm a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. This means in mafia terms, I'm a made man. At the council, people would meet over whiskey and talk about what to do, never taking into account what was happening with Ho Chi Minh in the jungles of Vietnam. It was compromises and deals made in Washington, not in Vietnam. And that often leads to real problems, that huge disconnect. And that what makes sense in Washington doesn't necessarily make sense the farther you get out from it. And I think that this issue, David would be rolling his eyes and saying, again, because I can tell you about the council, I knew when they had no answer to a problem, when at the council, at the end of a 3 or 4 hour meeting where they were trying to bore you to death and everyone had to get their say to see who would be the next undersecretary of whatever, they would say, well, since we don't know what to do, let's put sanctions on whoever. And everyone would nod. And that worked beautifully in a Washington kind of way, because you want to be seen to do something. The most dangerous words in foreign policy, do something, without doing enough to really change the basic dynamics. Because if you actually enact a policy, as we've talked about today, there are trade-offs immediately in the real world. Forget the fairy tales you're reading in the media at the moment. I blame a lot of you here for that. The simplistic story that there's one issue and that issue drives anything doesn't explain the planet I live on. It's trade-offs constantly, immediately, that one has to make, or one's living in a fairy tale and not the real world. And David would understand this. And so they'd say sanctions and everyone would leave the room. In other words, they'd done something without doing anything. And they would go back and say, well, we had a meeting and we are going to recommend to the president that we put sanctions in a one-size-fits-all blanket way on somebody. We were doing something without doing anything to take the real risk to say there are areas in the world where the United States has only peripheral interests. Not everything is equal. There are areas in the world where the United States has secondary interests. And there are areas of the world where the United States has fundamental primary interests it must do everything for. If you don't know the difference between those three things, again, it isn't all equal. It is not a debating society. It is about power. Power to do good, power to do bad. But if we don't talk about power, again, we're being children here about this. And this issue of sanctions, I think, does play into the war. Do I have to say the usual requisite things that I'm for the Ukrainians? I am. That I think Russian aggression needs to be checked? I do. But I also am an American patriot, an American nationalist, an American realist, and their primary, secondary, and tertiary interests. And to not see this is not to see the world as it really is. No interests of any two countries are ever the same. I remember talking to my Israeli colleagues and saying, so you say the US and Israel have different interests? Of course we do. You're an ally. You're a lockstep ally. You're Sundance to our Butch Cassidy. Absolutely. But our interests are not the same on every single issue when the sun comes up in the morning, nor is true with the UK where I grew up in the Anglosphere. Of course, we're cousins, as John Le Carre said, but our interests are not always the same. We fight all the time about all kinds of things. And to not see how policy is made here is to have a surface conversation rather than a real one. And I want to have a real conversation here. So the fertilizer issue is key. And I would just bring up 3 points that it's a pity the colleagues have left. It's been a very rich discussion, but I'll start with what they said and then feed into what I said, which never happens, but I think they're very good things to be mentioned here. The Ukrainian minister is right to mention, as he did at the end, that there will be 30 to 60% less cultivated land if the fertilizer issue isn't dealt with. I almost fell down. This is an absolutely fundamental real world micro issue. Then 30 to 60%. Less arable land in the breadbasket of Europe. And no alarm bells are ringing here. Thank heaven for his candor, and I wish him well. The Eurochem colleague of mine, who, and again, I have an example for them I'm not going to use, it just happens to be, talked about the indirect sanctions and how this works. That if someone that you had working with you is sanctioned, what did lawyers say? You all know lawyers, yes? Don't do it. But the company's fine. Don't do it. What about procurement? Don't do it. That's what lawyers are there to do. Their heightened sense of risk is the problem. It's why I have as few as I can in my political risk firm. The answer will always be don't do it. And the problem with don't doing it is if you are a huge percentage, the second largest by sales company in the world, you have to make up the difference. I mean, this is just common equity in the world. You have to, like with oil, Fertilizer is the same, or food. If you're going to get rid of a certain amount of calories, you have to find another set of calories to make it up, or you're not doing good in the world. And this indirect form of sanctions, nobody thought about. You know, it isn't that they sat down to do these things any more than the Kennedy guys wanted the Tet Offensive to happen. But there are unintended consequences when you apply a one-size-fits-all position to a world that's a complicated place. And then the last speaker, our colleague from the UN, who said a very interesting thing. He alluded to it. He was very polite. But let's look at it from a Ukrainian perspective. Of the 10 most populous countries in the world, only one of those 10 unambiguously supports Ukraine. That's the United States. All the rest are hedging, which is what you do if you're a developing country in the world. You hedge between superpowers. That's the math of geopolitics since Thucydides. That's the way it works. But you're not likely to win them over by starving them. That is unlikely to help. He was very polite. He works for the UN. I work for myself, which is a glory, because I can say what I think. And that is a problem. If one doesn't think smartly, how do we win over these other 9 countries? India, China, Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey. That's who we're talking about here, the developing world. As Kennedy, we're back to Kennedy, Jack Kennedy, who used his wealth to go see the developing world and said, maybe we shouldn't always side with the colonists. You know, maybe we should think a little more. You have to win them over. And I would start with those 3 points. But let's just quickly do the logic chain here. Since 1960, Malthus has been defeated yet again. We didn't all starve to death, as Malthus has been claiming since the 18th century. Why? We had innovation, as we always do. And food production increased by 211%. Why? Fertilizers. Just that simple. Fertilizers. 211% increase means that we can double our population. Without it, we have Malthus. You have to innovate, and that has been done. You can't stop innovating along the way, or you have a huge problem. As was mentioned before, roughly half the world's population depends on fertilizer use. Globally, roughly, and these numbers are only rough as they can be, about 2 billion people depend on the import of fertilizers. They don't have it innately, they have to import it. And so 2 billion people are dependent on fertilizers. And whether we like it or not, the 2 sanctioned states are 2 of the largest fertilizer exporters in the world, together combining for 22% of the number in 2019. Roughly 450 million people were fed by them. I'm not saying we don't put sanctions on Russia. I don't want to play this straw horse game. I'm entirely in favor of that. If anybody bothers reading me, I say this all the time to governments, to people. I write constantly, there it is. But we have to make up those 450 million people, or they will starve to death. And that really does bear mentioning in trade-offs that we're discussing. This damages the global food ecosystem because of this. Again, more than 20% of global fertilizer we're taking off. This could affect up to indirectly about 750 million people if we don't figure this out relatively quickly. I do political risk, and the basic political risk to spell out here is specifically we're looking at crop failures and famine. The most at-risk areas are the Middle East, North Africa, and the rest of the African continent. That's who we're looking at, would be the first domino to fall here. And in political risk terms, without going into a lot of detail, as I'm sure you can follow, you're going to have a refugee crisis that beggars description in Europe. You're going to radicalize Southern Europe even more than it's been, because you have a refugee crisis where the EU will be a day late and a dollar short, as inevitably it is about everything. They'll offer solidarity, everyone will weep, and nothing will happen. And that can't happen. This will happen quickly. A crisis is something that happens quickly. The EU often gets things right, but it doesn't do fast very well. And this will happen quickly. That's 1. 2, there'll be this radicalization. And 3rd, this will make the Arab Spring, if it's not dealt with, look like a picnic, the aftermath. You will have radicalization and people saying, how did it come to this? In North Africa, in this African subcontinent, and in the Middle East, which is not what any of us would want. And so there is a practical component for Europeans who don't buy the emotional humanitarian argument here as well. And that's the risk. That's where I'm interested. That's where my firm works, and those interests are what matter. To conclude, this means that the United States, the EU, and the UK should not get rid of all sanctions on Mr. Putin. I'm not saying that. Absolutely, some of the sanctions have been brilliant. That the SWIFT thing worked is amazing. I remember bankers telling me it would never work, and it has. We should look at the sanctions from the realist point of view, that the ones that work and further our cause and our interests should be kept in place, and the ones that don't should not. This seems to me obvious, and yet that's not how it works. People are either for sanctions, like a fairy tale, or against sanctions. My attitude is always Machiavellian's. It depends. It depends on which sanctions, at which time, on which country to do which thing. And if you don't talk like that, you're not doing good. You may be feeling good, but you're not doing good. I'd like to do good. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So we have maybe 10, 15 minutes for questions. Although Mr. Brico has left, I believe he's got a colleague somewhere who may be able to field questions for him. And do we still have Dr. Kituyi on the line?
Yes, you do.
Great. Thank you. Well, look, does anyone have any questions? Lady at the back.
Thank you very much, Pascal Ingabori, Pilots for Deaf. I have a really a simple question. Is that there is, in addition, as Mr. Kitu, you said, another plague, which is climate change, which has impacted a lot of people in the world already in 2022, with 23 million of people in risk of starvation in the Horn of Africa because of malnutrition and famine. So my question is, how does that come also into play? Because we can, of course, lift the sanctions against fertilizers, but it's not going to solve the whole problems of access to food in vulnerable areas, which comes, as I fully agree with you, as a real risk to stability.
John, would you like to take this?
When we talk about climate change, I roll my eyes. How do we solve it? What is it that we're solving? What sacrifices are we prepared to make? Are the Europeans if you've done a poll, do you want to get rid of nuclear power? Yes. Do you want to get rid of buying gas from literally everyone? Yes. Do you want to freeze in the winter? No. This is not a joined up argument. I fully believe in global warming. I, again, have to say these ridiculous things because otherwise, if I'm critical, we get the straw man that Bill Maher brought out the other day. Of course I do. Of course it's a problem. But I'm so sick of going to lectures where we talk about global warming, and then the answer is always socialism. It's not going to be the answer. I'm not going to let you have socialism by the back door if I didn't let you buy it by the front door, neither are the European people. Forget the Americans. Neither are the Chinese, by the way. What happened the minute there was a problem with energy? China kicked up more coal plants. Germany is not going to meet the standards because it's doing coal. You have to go back a step and say, what are the trade-offs we have to make to reach the goals that we want to meet, and not just mandate, as the UN, the EU so often do. Someday in the future, we're going to put these mandates and somehow you'll meet them. And we'll do what you say. Xi Jinping made it very clear in the coming up to the 20th Party Conference that rather than his people being in danger of not being heated, he'd kick in some more coal plants. This will always happen until we have a joined up discussion about how we're going to, in policy terms, get to global warming. Again, I'm totally with you, but I don't want to feel good. I want to do good. And if the trade-off is to freeze in the winter, Greta's, in for a problem. By the way, the Greta can't name 3 members of the Chinese Communist Party is another problem. This is the children's crusade. If you can't name 3 members of the Communist Party, you can't solve global warming because they're the ones doing the polluting. And if you can't talk to them and know how Chinese politics works, I don't know what this is, but it's not serious.
Lady at the front here. Do you want to take a mic?
Thank you. Sarah Wheaton with Politico. Just hoping you can explain a little bit about the origins of this event, who sponsored it, how speakers were chosen, just so we can understand a little bit the background. Thanks.
The event. Well, there's a small news portal on the internet called EU Political Report, and about once a month we try and organize a topical event, and we put this together we started putting it together about 6 weeks ago, when it was obvious that one of the most serious problems that was going to affect all of us in Europe would be the consequences of the fallout from the war in Ukraine and the impact that would have on agricultural production and our prices. You know, our food prices are going up dramatically. The supermarkets in Belgium are refusing to accept, to pass on to customers some of the prices that have been demanded by food suppliers. Inflation is being managed in some countries better than others, but in my own, in Britain, it's forecast. It's not all about the food crisis, but it's forecast to rise to over 18% by the end of the year, which is the highest it has been since 1976. So we chose this as being something of topical interest, and we wanted people to be more aware of it and on the impact of our lives. I also happen to be a strong supporter of Ukraine in their fight for freedom. As a Scot, we have always fought for our freedom, and we like people who have a similar stripe in their DNA. Yeah, it's not that I'm anti-Russian, but I just belong to the people who believe what they're doing is wrong. It's aggressive warmongering, and the rest of the world should do their best to call them to book. So maybe if I can, on the back of your question, put a question to Dr. Kituyi, which is...
Just clarify, is there a sponsor for this event, or are you paying for this event? Who's paying the cost?
What costs?
Well,
My time?
supposedly-
The sandwiches?
Sure.
It's...
Mr. Rico's travel, Mr. Holzman's, Dr. Holzman's travel.
It's, yeah, I'm paying for it. I've done this before, and if I believe in something, I will put my money behind it. We sponsored an event here 2-3 years ago to draw attention to another issue I felt strongly about, which was the imprisonment of Ukrainian journalist Roman Sushenko. With my friend and colleague who's in the room, he remembers it. Well, we were successful, and he was released from prison in Moscow. After, okay, it was about 2 years after we had the event, but there was a result. So it's not always about money, it's about results. So on the back of your question, I wanted to ask Dr. Kituyi a question, which is, Dr. Holzman here said that only 1 out of the 10 most populous countries were supporting Ukraine. Okay, so I wondered, do you have a comment, please? Is there more that the United Nations could do to rally support? I understand, of course, Russia is on the Security Council, and it's difficult for the United Nations, but it seems to most people in the world illogical that the largest warmonger on the planet should be on the Security Council. Could we not please see a stronger role for the UN to get behind Ukraine in this conflict?
Well, thank you. First of all, as I mentioned in my introduction, I have ended my tour of duty as a senior officer, as an Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. So now I'm a free citizen. I can also speak freely. But I thought part of the value of a discourse as what we're having is to inform international engagement that the best way to win friends and keep friends is to also look at the collateral damage of certain actions that may be well-intentioned, but you had not looked at what repercussions they can have. So the food insecurity in developing countries is partly directly a consequence of the malign activity around Ukraine, but also collateral damage to restrictive behavior on mercantile trade and the global value chains that have been affected drastically by the happenings around Russia. And I suppose addressing those concerns can be an important contribution to expanding or firming up international solidarity on this important matter. But also there are other geopolitical dynamics that have nothing to do with the global commodity turbulences. I mean, the relations between China and Russia on this, I don't think has very much to do with the impact of this war on the Chinese population or on the world. And those are extraneous to what can be done in the context of sanctioning Russian behavior in Ukraine. But let me also mention something about the first question which was raised about climate change. I think it's useful that we do not get to pull climate change into everything, as it were. It's an important discourse, but it is not on the table right now when we're looking at the vulnerabilities in Africa. I only brought it up because Africa has the least contribution to global warming of all the continents, perhaps apart from South Pacific. I come from a country which already 5 years ago had satisfied the ambitions of Agenda 2030 that you have at least 1/3 of your power from renewable sources. We have more than 48% of our sources renewable, but we are in the double bummer right now of failed rains, high price of petroleum, inaccessible and expensive fertilizers in the main planting season. So the cycle is inevitable. There is famine down the line in a few months. And those are inescapable, but they should not derail us from how can we ease the burden of collateral damage from sanctioning.
We have one last question, sorry, 3 last questions. The gentleman here, please. And then after the questions, you're very welcome to join us for lunch.
Yes, I have 2 questions. One of the first questions was the Deputy Minister of Ukraine. He said that the Ukraine is getting $60 for 1 ton coming, and that they needed €100, and that they don't get even the price now that they would need to pay for everything. A second question was regarding the reasoning of John Hulsman. He said that the Arab Spring would look like a picnic if this problems with the food security goes on. And you made also a prediction of 450 million people who are at risk. But the last figures that I saw with the World Food Programme were to 150 to 200 million people. And I wanted to know how you get to this figure. Thank you.
For the first question, unfortunately, the Ukrainian minister is no longer online, but we can feed your question back and try and get you an answer. Second question, John.
The derivation of these things, and I'll send you our notes. I'll give you a card and you can look at how we derive that. I don't think it really matters. I mean, if it's 250 or 450, I know that we're right. I'm confident my risk firm gets this right. We're proud of getting it right. We say provocative things, and so my neck is constantly on the line, and we're constantly checking, rechecking. And I will get you that number. But the bottom line is that not only is this a vast number of people that we have to fill quickly, and this is the problem. This has been a jolt, a shock, an immediate thing. It's not a gradual, we can phase this in process, but it is somewhat geographically specific, as we've said, that it isn't, not every area is equally vulnerable at the same time, that we're talking specifically the Middle East, North Africa, and the rest of the African continent. And so looking at the political risk there is a good way to start. That's where I got interested in writing about this, as I do. And again, it's just going sanctions bit by bit. There are many. I'm going to Washington in 2 weeks to see people, as I do normally, and do that. And I will say that, look, there need to be some new sanctions. There need to be a refining of this process. But that bluntly saying all sanctions are good or bad is ridiculous, fairy tale. And that we need to focus, as you say, on the actual people involved and on our interests. And it's certainly in our interest of this part of the world to not go up in flames again, which is certainly could. Certainly the danger of that goes way off the chart if we don't solve this problem. So doing good and doing right actually go together here. But I will get you that number.
Okay, thank you.
lady at the back, whilst the microphone's being handed, just to add to John's comment there, two of Ukraine's biggest grain markets are in North Africa, Egypt and Tunisia. They're big customers. So if Ukraine exports a hit, their prices are going to be badly hit, and they'll need to find alternative suppliers.
Just to jump in briefly, if we're going to be even more specific, yes, it's Egypt we're talking about. We saw before when the price of bread went up, the Mubarak administration was removed, I think, a week later. I mean, there was a spike, they went out. They have about a week's supply. It's very limited, very much precarious, very dependent on the flows continuing. And if you're going to look at one country to really watch in risk terms, it would be Egypt for all these very specific technical reasons.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes, so my question was for Mr. Brijo. So I don't know if there's someone that can answer on his behalf.
Can't hear you.
My question was for Samir Brijo. So I'm not sure if there's someone here that can answer in his behalf. You said that maybe there was someone that worked with him that could answer to my question.
Is it for you?
Yeah.
If you stick with us for lunch, we can probably find him. He told me he was staying, but okay.
Yeah, sure. Then I'll wait for it.
Lady here, you had a question. This is the last question.
Thank you. Bonaldi, Association Royale de la Presse Nord-Sud. I'm a journalist. And I've been listening to everybody and hearing the kind of a wording, terminology you've been using. Some of you have been using. Collateral damage of the sanctions, I heard from Mr. Kitouye, Dr. Kitouye. The last word he said was collateral damage from the sanctions. Don't you think we should talk about collateral damage of the war of aggression that's going on? I mean, this has nothing to do with global sanctions or specific sanctions that have been taken for years now, because it's not the first flow of sanctions taken as it was thought it should be. Maybe it should be modified and specified and maybe more to the point. But it's definitely, unless you prove the contrary, gentlemen who have spoken about collateral damage from the sanctions. Could they please come back to reality? Because it is definitely not a fairy tale. I agree, Dr. Huisman. This is not a fairy tale. Thank you.
Okay, let me just have a word about that. First of all, the upending global commodity prices and the global uncertainties that have come are an immediate direct consequence of the war. What I call collateral damage is an intended consequence of policy action. Now, the war is not a consequence of sanction. The crisis, the petroleum prices, the fertilizer prices, the food crisis are direct consequences of Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the disruptions of access to and price of fertilizer in the global south is an unintended consequence of some of the policy actions that were meant to apply a certain pain and restraint on Russia. That's why I call them collateral. I don't think that the two are the same thing.
Want to add anything? I think, you know, any policy is always going to have consequences. That's why politicians take decisions. Some of those consequences are unintentional. And I think this is what we were discussing. But on that note, maybe if we could break for lunch, please stay with us, and you can ask our remaining speakers embarrassing questions. David Kovac, the Director of Communications for Eurochem, is here, I believe, and you can catch him over lunch too. Dr. Kituyi, I'm so sorry we will not be able to serve you lunch, but perhaps we can have you over here in Brussels sometime soon to entertain you properly.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And on that note, thank you very much, everybody. Please join us for a simple lunch. Thank you.